So we all know Silksong is incredible and filled with immense passion behind it, but recently, with all of this cut content being revealed, I started wondering, was the old Silksong better? I am referring to the state of the game that included the Red Coral Gorge, Clover Grove, and most importantly, had no bile water. There was even a whole damn ocean travel mechanic. The majority of this content got cut just before the 2022 Xbox trailer. So I really want to answer this question. Just what would the game be like if it was released a year earlier? With this video, I plan to go through the entire progression of the 2021 version of the game. This is the one with the most content before all of the cutting. And I've also decided to cover a few months around it due to some things like the Caravantula and Bellway tokens. At this point in time, the acts likely did not exist, as this is something the developers started working on after 2021. This means that there was no abyss and no true ending of the game. The true ending at this point in time would have had to do with ringing every single song shrine throughout the world. Lastly, while a lot of these areas and objectives are factual, this video will contain a lot of speculation on how the progression paths would work. So while a lot of it will not be objectively true, it is usually extremely likely. I also really want to help modders in potentially recreating areas like the Red Coral Gorge. It would be so cool to see. So let's begin right at the beginning, the Moss Grotto. The tutorial was mostly the same except that there was a second weaver door we could find on the western side of the area. This is something that is going to be relevant a lot later. We also know that this part of the game where a hornet gets the weakness cutscene used to hold these silk flowers. So maybe that weakness would actually drain your silk bar. That would have for sure pissed off some people even more than these cutscenes do now. The ruined chapel was known as the Old Church, and the Moss Mother would actually be skippable if we are able to dodge all of her eggs, allowing her to sleep in peace as we enter the Marrow. The Bone Forest, as we all know it, was very similar to the current version of the game, but this bench at the beginning would rise out of the ground rather than being paid, and this is because it was known as a holy bench. If we sit on these benches, we are allowed to string up rosaries, and they likely also had a special pin on the map that could be bought from Chakra, who was standing just before a much bigger and more convoluted moss home. All of this could have been the Moss Temple, the original location of the druid. A part of it was connected to that cursed spot in Shellwood, but it doesn't look like the player could go up anywhere without cling grip. It also may have been a one-way breakable wall from behind after being cursed, which is more likely to me. We could also buy the simple key and execute the Acnet skip to enter the Clover Grove early on, running away from the Craggler before reaching the room with the mass shard. This is where the locked door would be located, and unlocking it was very likely allowing us to explore some of the grove, just like Worm Vase today. And yes, I know the way that I say the word worm is weird, but bear with me, please. Going over a pretty interesting route here would allow us to reach Shellwood and skip pretty much a huge chunk of the early game. But we ain't gonna do that loser shit. Let's go back on track to the Marrow, which upon freeing and defeating the Bell Beast would run away instead of emerging, and would not drop a silk heart. This led us into the first song shrine of the game, which were a major part of the progression, as ringing all of them would allow us to reach the true ending of Silksong. Since we lack access to public transportation, we actually had to trek through more of the Marrow to find the Caravantula and free it, allowing fast travel back to Bone Bottom for a price. The Caravantula was the player's best friend before the Bell Beast could be retamed. It was this weird spider with a carriage that would actually carry the player in it. One last change in the Marrow was an additional wish involving the Learned Pilgrim, which would require cling grip to access. This quest required us to collect these disgusting bound organs from pilgrims and bring them to the shady old man who was researching the cause of the haunting. And look, I ain't messing with that, screw that guy. While the intended progression path today is to enter Deep Docks right after the Marrow, that may not have been the case in this earlier version, as the player actually had to trek through some of Hunter's Nest first to enter the docks through the back door, as the main door was actually locked. Now of course this could have been easily changed very early on, but I will pretend it wasn't to potentially figure out how this would have worked. The Scar Guard room was still there, but at this point in time it may have been a gauntlet instead. There was some pretty demanding platforming that had what looked to be quite a runback. I don't know what the purpose of this hallway was, but I doubt it was an arena because the one required for the dash is still there, and we already had one just beforehand. While more of the nest was accessible at this point, we will come back to it later just like any normal player would with more upgrades at their disposal, and not make the same mistake the majority of players did who left negative positive reviews on Silksong's Steam page. So let's picture that we enter the deep docks through the back door and obtain the dash. The area was mostly the same except for one key difference, and it's the fact that the Lace Arena probably required a key to be unlocked rather than just hitting a lever, and this key would be found deeper in the area. After defeating Lace, we would enter the Wild Song Shrine, which is coincidentally the only song shrine we know the name of, and that leads us into Farfields. This area remains mostly the same with a couple of differences. First of all, we could see the mottled scar here. I don't know why, but it's cool. Another difference was the Pilgrim's Rest, which was some sort of structure rather than being in the remains of a skeleton. Surprisingly, Huntress was also on the opposite side of here, and it is unknown if her quest even existed at this point, or if it was even the exact same, as the player did not have tools to actually complete it. Upon obtaining the cloak and defeating the fourth chorus, it would actually drop a silk heart. This was probably the silk heart which could move to the Bell Beast. Now we could head to Greymoor, where we could obtain the second silk spell, but also be able to open up another Bellway. The purpose of this Bellway was likely for Pharloom Bay, which I will get into way later. Of course, the Reaper crests could be found here, and how crests work at this time is the more you use them, the more experience you would have to unlock their slots. Quite a terrible system. Before entering Bellhart, we would have likely had to defeat Morwink, but there was actually another way in, and it revolved around the Caravantula. It is impossible to know when specifically this option would appear, but the NPC would charge a premium price of fucking 999 rosaries to travel to Bellhart. This guy is truly an opportunist. As for how we would get these, I don't know, but this was likely the Morwink skip back then. Bellhart is one of those locations that will be impossible for us to get a clear picture of, but it would have been haunted from the beginning and required us to beat Widow to free it. Shellwood is next, of course, which was surprisingly really similar to today. The only difference I can see is that the Underworkers had an outpost here, and while it is unknown if we could engage with that outpost or possibly enter the Underworks through it, I doubt it. Mainly because entering the Citadel this early on would be weird. The Underworkers did have some sort of purpose though, and they were definitely active in the environment, due to them repairing this bridge leading to the Coral Steps later in the game, which meant that Team Cherry actually changed the lore of these guys later in development, as they were originally allowed to leave their workplace and go around Pharloom. They may have been the Menderbug of this game. So sad. After defeating Sister and obtaining the Cling Grip, we now have access to some major areas, some of those being the Red Coral Gorge and possibly the Weavenest. Although we must return to Bellhart, and upon doing so, we could explore these Bellways that were much larger than today. While it is unknown and quite literally impossible to tell what purpose these rooms served, they did look important, like how Widow's string would actually go up to the massive bell on top of the area. Upon defeating Widow herself, we wouldn't actually get the needle in. In fact, the only thing that would happen was a special memory being played to us. Widow probably wouldn't die either, instead having some sort of date with Pond Catcher Reed. What a Chad. These Bellways may also have been the place where you could meet the Bell Beast once again and tame it, unlocking the main fast travel system. As for the Caravantula, I don't think he would actually become obsolete, because there was this mechanic called Bellway tokens. These tokens were used to unlock single stations on the map for the Bell Beast. We could probably find these in the world and purchase them from NPCs. Probably how finding memory lockets works today, so I definitely see this as a good way to balance these two fast travel systems without making the other obsolete. You may have noticed that I've also not mentioned a single witch so far other than the learned pilgrim, and that is because I believe a majority of them were the exact same, but there are some we are going to talk about later that matter. I have also not yet mentioned subscribing and checking out my Patreon if you wish to support these videos. It would be really appreciated. So let's get up to speed. We currently have the dash, the cling grip, and the drift cloak. We have been ringing every single song shrine we found so far, those being the one in the Marrow, the one in Farfields, the one in Greymoor, the one in Shellwood, and lastly the Bellhart one. Today, these are all required to open up the Citadel, but in the game we are currently playing, that does not matter at all, and at this point in time, we should do a lot of backtracking before visiting the Red Coral Gorge. Like the Hunter's Nest, an area that was very minimal to us initially, but now that we have a few upgrades, we can actually explore it way more. By using what looks to be a dash jump and cling grip, we could reach a small set of rooms rooms and potentially open a shortcut on the bottom. I don't know what significance these rooms would have, however. By continuing through the hallways, we make our way to the Chapel of the Beast. But at this point in time, it was likely the Beastmaster's den, where his arena would be found. It's also possible that last claws were here too, conceptualized as the Bone Hunter Chiefs, as really hard enemies, using both grounded and flying attacks that would guard the boss. I am confident that defeating the Beastmaster would grant us the Beast Crest. By using the claw to glide, we can reach another part of the nest. This one with some heavy platforming leading to some sort of important room that I just cannot grasp the purpose of. Very reoccurring theme here. Same with the end of the area. I don't know what any of this stuff is, but it seems important. However, this is where we would be upgrade checked, as we need the claw line to progress further and open up the bonus section of the fields leading to Hunter Queen Karmelita. Since I don't know at exactly what point in time this would happen, Krieg would also open up his basement, possibly during the quest with the Gormand, allowing us to go down into the end tunnels and create a shortcut back to the nest. I do not know if the basement would remain open after this, but let's say it would be due to this room that looks like a missable collectible, like a flea. Now, if you remember back when we could traverse the Clover Grove to reach Shellwood, there was actually another thing we could do, and that is entering Bone Grave early on, which was at the time actually the mausoleum. It was much larger and not a subworld, and while it likely would have given us the Wanderer crest, it also potentially could have served as an entrance to the Weavenest, but not before we would be cling grip checked. However, this quote-unquote entrance may have also worked in the complete opposite way, being a pathway for us while inside of the Weavenest instead. It is impossible to know how we may have been able to enter the Weavenest, since supposedly the Needle Inn was located inside of it, so unlocking these two big doors was not an option, unless they were unlocked without the Needle Inn in the first place. This is something that got me completely stumped, and I am not going to keep talking about it and speculating to oblivion, but at this point in time the Weavenest was extremely likely accessible as well, either through Bone Grave through the Weaver doors or something that we just cannot see. By entering from the western side, we will be led into a few vertical rooms with two elevators, leading down to a Bellway and Eva. The Bellway was necessary here as we were going to be returning to Eva quite a lot. By continuing to the upper right, we would enter the main Moss room that today holds a double Moss Mother fight. It is unknown if this fight was a thing, but it may have been blocking the elevator in the first place. This is finally when we would reach some sort of strange altar. This altar was likely the place where we would obtain the Weaver crest or the Needle Inn, but I am more inclined to believe the former. Every single crest is obtained through a corpse, and what looks to be on this altar seems like a corpse, potentially a corpse of the Weaver priestess, which was an NPC mentioned in relation to the Weaver crest. Of course, she may have also just lived inside of the Weavenest during this time, but that is impossible to know. By progressing up from here, we would at some point get the Needle Inn, and while these three lit rooms remain a mystery, the last one seems to hold the map fragment of the Weavenest. By continuing into this Marrow extension, we would be met with a Weaver fountain. These were the equivalent of the dream trees from Hollow Knight. Once the Needle Inn is played, they would spit out orbs we had to collect, and once all are collected, the fountain would return to normal and upgrade our attunement level. This is a very recurring mechanic in Silksong, and we will see a lot more of these fountains as we go. Attunement is interesting because it seems to be a system that would allow us to play the Needle Inn faster, but also obtain some unique interactions, like activating Nyleth's Guardian and fighting it, which is of course Seth. Another mechanic of the attunement is that some later holy benches were likely only going to rise out of the ground if our level was high enough while playing the Needle Inn, which would also make sense, as this whole system just got replaced by the Rosary economy, making some later areas gated by not having a bench to rest on, possibly regulating progression. The reason why I believe the Needle Inn had to be obtained close to here is because in Hollow Knight the Dream Tree is placed right next to the place the player obtains the Dream Nail, so it would make sense to introduce this mechanic immediately. There was another Weaver fountain in this huge horizontal room at the bottom of the area, and well, that's about it from what I can gather. And with all of that out of the way, we can continue the main story, accessing the coral steps through the big chasm that currently leads into Blast Steps. But instead of them being sandy and swept away by time, they are full of life and house a way different atmosphere. This would mean that the wind did not pose any sort of threat to the player, and while the judge enemies on the path still existed, they had this mechanic which would let them proclaim Hornet innocent and not attack her. The trick here is that this would only happen if Hornet has not killed a single bug on the way here, there, which is where that Moss Mother skip comes into play. It was probably some convoluted speedrun strategy that Team Cherry decided to scrap. The other enemies in this subsection may have been the Coral Pilgrims, these weird yellow balls, and probably the smaller conch flies. And speaking of those, it looks like they had the wish which revolved around us going around and killing them, collecting their crust for the citizens of Bellhart. We had access to a holy bench at the beginning, as we had to climb our way through this room fighting the judges to get back to the chasm. After that, we will have to do some platforming in the chasm itself, which is actually something we have clear footage of. It looks like we could go back west at this point, which would lead to a dead end with some sort of pickup. Instead, by going east, there would be another steps room, this one holding a Weaver fountain, which would eventually all culminate into another holy bench at the top. This is where we would be able to fight the first boss of the gorge, the double conch flies. The reason why we know this as a boss room was due to the sketch text Coral Drill. And well, it is an arena, quite a big one at that. It is unknown if we would kill both of the conch flies here, but I am confident that they dropped the conch cutter. The steps area was also, for whatever reason, filled to the brim with plasmium pots. The purpose of this is completely unknown. We don't know whether or not Xylotl was even in the game at this point, so the functionality of these is impossible to deduce. We could find this bellway by ascending higher into the steps, and somewhere around here was probably another spot for the caravantula that had to be cleared before being accessible. By going to the left, we would be met with the final room before the last judge. However, this is also where we could unlock a checkpoint to go back to the Coral Drill bench, so the last judge practically had no run back. I'm sure many would like this one. Before we fight the judge though, I want to go back and talk about the rest of the accessible area. Almost half of the gorge was actually covered in citadel structuring, which makes me think that Khan and the Citadel had some sort of alliance in these early versions of the game. By going west from the last judge arena, we could find the path up to Mount Faye, but this path was extremely likely a one-way entrance for the mountain, meaning it is completely inaccessible to us at this point in time. By continuing further, we would be abruptly stopped by a double jump check, which marks the end of the area for now. There are a few more rooms we can explore as well, but none of these are very important other than that they lead to this strange structure that looks like some sort of aquarium. No idea what this shit was. By defeating the last judge, the Citadel would immediately open up with no song shrine requirements, as those were only necessary for the true ending. Of course, we can easily continue into the Citadel from here, but we are speedrunners, aren't we? We ain't gonna do that shit. Instead, we are going to take the alternate route to the Dust Roach Pens, requiring the Cling Grip to access. This was the old version of Sinner's Road, completely white and full of dust. There were also no muck maggots in this area, as at this point in time, bile water did not exist. We could obtain the dust pillow from Curl and Benjin here as well, a tool similar to the pin pillow that would cause dust to appear, all the while having similar reactions. The mist entrance was still here, which at the time was known as the Dust Maze, and functioned pretty much the exact same with a slightly different color scheme. The purpose of all of these dust references in general is kind of unknown, but the area was very themed around it while still keeping its Greymoor side with the dust roaches and keepers. Oh yeah, as Jim and Styx were still here, god damn it man. But that's not all, as breaking this wall that leads us to bile water would actually lead us into the reworked version of the Gloom, an area that is very likely internally known as Shadow. The Shadowlands, as I will call them, was a very similar area to bile water in terms of verticality, filled with these abyssal spikes while being extremely dark, making me think that it's possible that Team Cherry played around with some of the light mechanics in this place. By ascending up, we would be met face to face with a monstrous Gloom Beast, the creature spitting purple acid seen in the reveal trailer. This enemy was reused in the Abyss, but back then it was probably a very dangerous hazard mini-boss similar to the Craggler we had to play around. It is also likely that this room is where we would be double jump checked, as it was impossible for us to reach the Pale Lake without upgrades. By falling down into the western room, we would probably reach the second entrance to the Mist, which all leads us to the Exhaust Organ. The organ was very similar, except there was one key difference. Originally, these smaller rooms used to house tubes that held the organ sleepers. 3 of these figures exist in the game files, but their functionality is completely unknown. After defeating the Phantom and obtaining a cross stitch, we could finally enter the Coral Chambers. But to continue onward with the main Judgment route, we fall into the Underworks where we could potentially open up the Shellwood outpost as well. The Underworks also had a path to this giant bell in Bellhart, but the purpose of this bell is completely unknown, as the good old father did not exist at this time. The old Wisp ticket would also likely be accessible around this point as well, but we have so little information about it that makes it impossible to know its purpose. It had this weird reddish foliage though, and still retained the bamboo forest aesthetic. This is the point in time where the progression becomes extremely similar to the base game, as we just had to do Citadel stuff to progress, like obtaining the 3 melodies. One quest that got cut from the game in Songclave, which of course was way more important due to the first shrine, was collecting cogs from the Clover core, with the reward remaining unknown. But let's be real, it was probably just rosaries, useless. After obtaining the clone line, a lot of backtracking was set in place. But before that, let's actually finish the game and obtain the base ending, shall we? Upon obtaining the melodies and defeating Lace in the Cradle, we could find some interesting rooms that implied something else was going on here. One of these rooms was the enigmatic Bell Hub. This room was built out of massive weaver structures that glow with a pale light, while having a front-facing weaver door. But hey, let's ignore that and smack Grandmother Silk's ass. Upon binding the boss, the Strung to Serve ending would activate, letting GMS absorb Hornet and evolve into an even stronger being than before, one infused with the power of the Pale King. Not a very good ending, huh? Let's fix that. Let's go back to the Clover Grove. If we have not obtained the simple key and unlocked the door, we could access the grove through Shellwood instead, similarly to the Wormways route, although it does look like we would be gated off exploring without that key, so fuck that. The enemies in the area were the Aspid Collector, which is in the game today in Mossholm, referred to as the Acnid, the Grove Pilgrimfly, a more dangerous enemy that also spawned hatchlings, and the Aspid Hopper. This thing is disgusting. The area was full of these acid hazards as well, and it is unknown if the waters were safe. While only the Pilgrim has actual AI in the game today, the acid effect would drain our silk bar as long as we are in the close proximity of it, which means that this acid effect that was the threat of the grove likely influenced the muck effect. Also, the mantises of Verdania were likely enemies somewhere deeper in the area as well, due to the sketches labeling them as such. After a lot of platforming, we could unlock a bellway and reach the grove home, which was at this point in time called Greenhaven, acting as a mini dungeon with a weaver spire going right through it. This was a very vertical room consisting of mainly platforming challenges, with likely no boss fights. We can reach the spire here to obtain an ability, and that ability was most certainly the Sharp Dart, as that is what you get in Weavenest Karn today. This is pure speculation, but by doing even more platforming, we could possibly leave Greenhaven on the complete opposite side of the area, and jump down to reach the lake at the far end of the grove. This is where we could open a shortcut to the Bellway, and it is unknown what the purpose of the lake was at the time. Maybe we had to do something to make a song shrine rise out of the ground, maybe the Green Prince was there and we had some sort of wish or interaction with him. It is truly impossible to tell, but I am glad that this room made it into the game today. It is my personal favorite room, I love it. This is the point in the game where pretty much everything opens up, so there are likely a lot of quests to be done just like in the final release. The cursed content, the gourmand wish, all of that stuff. It is also when we could go back and fight Cygnus and Gron, but the aftermath of this fight is unknown. The abyss did not exist after all, so there was no purpose to the diving bell. All we really know is that the boss slightly dropped the silk heart and there was a weaver fountain at the bottom. So now let's imagine a scenario where we go to the slab through the citadel or get kidnapped. By unlocking the bellway, we would be able to access the mountain, where we could also open up a shortcut back to the Coral Gorge and get a weaver fountain on the way. The climb to the top was pretty similar, but there are some strange differences here and there, like the bizarre amount of citadel structures that invoke the whole area. So there was likely some more content regarding these. Things like Brightwane didn't exist, instead there were these purple crystals or something that cannot be explained. We would of course get the double jump after calling the Faithorn, but there was also this strange room to the east which reminds me of some sort of altar. Genuinely no idea what this was. So I obviously wasn't originally going to be talking about this, but as you all know, Team Cherry has announced the first Silksong DLC, Sea of Sorrow. I have to flex that we are the ones that figure out how this DLC would have worked before the announcement, and that's all thanks to the amazing ACMI mission. I will now proceed to potentially spoil a huge chunk of the DLC for you, or well, how it would have worked if it released in 2021. So if you are new here or are in general unaware of how the cut content of this ocean would have worked, please skip to the timestamp on screen. Like with any Team Cherry content, I assume it's best experienced blind, so don't ruin that experience for yourself and watch out for spoilers on the internet. Let's go back to my inferior past self. I think by this point we would have full access to Pharloom Bay. We could access this area at some point through the broken down door near Crow Lake, and I am assuming some sort of event was going to happen to make this door break. And it is unknown if that event was even implemented. By exploring the bay, we would notice these barnacles everywhere as the whole area was bordering an ocean. We would be able to meet the hermit crab in a tiny town, and while it is unknown what events would transpire from here, we were likely able to obtain some sort of sea vessel that would allow us to explore the ocean itself. This hut was also likely related to it, potentially housing the NPC that would drive us or craft this vessel in the first place. We were able to sail these 4 different rooms, which looked to have platforming and exploration. At the end or in the middle of our journey, we would reach strange areas like the lab, a strange ocean outpost, and this underground watery area. It is unknown what significance any of these islands had, but we know they existed. Either way, this whole travel system is a banger. But now, let us finish the Coral Gorge. By finally being able to pass that double jump check, we are led into this massive vertical room with the pinstress structure on top. This room was only accessible from down below to us initially, with the bridge blocking the way up. The way to get up to the structure is actually by using these updraft clams that are scattered throughout the room, acting similarly to the springs in far fields. These guys look really weird floating in one spot like this, so it was likely they would actually swim up and down and change the trajectory of their wind by doing so. They even have these little wings or fins, which is a really cool gameplay element. We would likely have to use this one clam under the bridge to reach another one. Very sick and cute stuff. This is where we would get the charge slash, of course. Also, at some point the pinstress could be fought with a different theme song than originally, likely because there was no threat of the void in Act 3. Now we can continue onward to a more structured and primal version of the gorge, with bones of what looked to be massive ancient bugs. There were a bunch of rooms here that looked to be hallways and some sort of bridge leading to the tower, but it doesn't look like we could use this stop path, instead going down from below to open a shortcut. In the middle of all of this is a strange circular room that could have been the gauntlet with the pearl divers. These guys were mentioned in Ari's sketchbook, and the arena was going to feature them coming out of the water and attacking us in waves with additional fish. It is unknown if this gauntlet was related to anything in the game, but there is a quest in a reveal trailer called Glimmering Pearls. I am also not sure about this, but Watcher at the Edge may have been a thing as well, requiring a specific attunement level to be awakened. And now we finally reach the Coral Tower, which was actually open and not part of a memory like today. The tower was also likely a bit different, as we can see from this pre-release material. It looks like it was going to feature platforming with checkpoints, all the while the player had to battle gauntlets. So it would have actually been scaling the Warlord's tower physically. At the top of the tower is where Khan would be fought, and after defeating him we can ring the Coral Song Shrine. This leads us to the top of the tower balcony, where we can do a jump to reach the old version of Weavenest, a much bigger sub-area of the gorge that had the vault worm at the top. It is likely that we would be able to leave the area through a one-way wall on the right after that, finishing up the Red Coral Gorge for good. I can definitely see why people would prefer this version of the area over the Blasted Steppes and Sands of Karak, and it did seem to have a more clear gameplay structure and more original mechanics. However, it just wouldn't fit very well with the lore of the game in my opinion. I think there is some charm in Karak as well. I do personally slightly prefer the gorge, but I really hope that modders can make this area a reality though. This is the point in time where we had all the necessary upgrades to finish the Hunter's Nest as well, as that claw line check can be easily handled now, leading us into the Farfields extension of the area. This is pretty similar to the final game. Hunter Queen Karmelita's Colosseum was likely gated under some sort of flag though, and I think that requirement was possibly related to defeating both the Beastmaster and the Trapmaster. In this case, the Trapmaster being Gur the Outcast. After Gur, the Hunter Queen could be fought, having been alive and in her prime during all of this. This is where though I get stumped, because I do not know what rewards Gur nor Karmelita would give us, but we can speculate that a pale oil used to be located somewhere in the nest, because the Flea Festival was not a thing back then. Maybe it was a reward for one of these two, likely Gur. We also lack information on whether or not there were any song shrines in the nest, but it's very likely that this entire area was pure optional content, which is a bit mind-boggling. Since we have the wings now, we can also wrap up the Shadowlands, which is unfortunately unfinished, but since we have the power of the sketches, I assume it would be a lot bigger like Bilewater was in the final game. It had these red spikes and foliage that was likely difficult to navigate around and avoid, and it would also lead to both the Whispering Vaults and the Pale Lake. At some point in time here, a song shrine could be found and rank. This song shrine was actually relocated to Bilehaven in later versions of the game before being ultimately cut, which I thought was worth mentioning. Finally, this all leads us into one part of Pharloom left to explore. explore, and that's Nyleth's shrine. It was originally known as the long-forgotten secret guarded by Seth, the one chosen by the voice. This voice was most certainly Nyleth, who was at the time known as the Flower Queen. We know that Seth had to be activated by playing the needle in with high enough attunement, and it's likely many other bosses had this functionality as well if the player was targeting the true ending. Upon defeating Seth, we would fight the Queen, and by defeating her, a shortcut would probably open in Lower Shellwood. It is unknown what point this would have, but it could possibly have led to the last song shrine in the game. And at this point, we had done it. We have rung every single song shrine in Silksong. All that is left is to return to the Grotto and enter the front-facing Weaver door, leading into the Bell Hub. It is unknown what we would actually do in here, but upon doing something, massive bell sounds would begin to attack GMS, stunning her periodically during the battle. Once the fight is over, a different ending would occur. We do not know what this ending was, but it could have been the Weaver Queen ending or something else entirely. Maybe even the Abyss ending, considering that the team did plan the Abyss around that point and anchored around it, just did not make any of it. It's a pretty interesting mechanic, these song shrines, but honestly I think cutting them was probably the correct move, as what we got feels a bit more unique, while a lot of these may feel very repetitive after a while. Now, after beating the game is where we would unlock the Silk Soul mode instead of the Steel Soul mode, and while we don't know what it was truly about, it was related to the attunement system and the bell shrines. And that's it, that's the whole of Silksong in 2021. So was this version of the game better? Well, it really depends on what type of player you are. If you hated Bilewater, you may have had a better time with the Shadowlands, in turn losing the Abyss. If you disliked Blasted Steppes and Sands of Karak, you may have really enjoyed the Coral Gorge. If you do not like the Vern Vase and all of its Lightblood intricacies, the Clover Grove was likely for you. I think it's fair to say that this version of the game truly had potential, if not for Team Cherry cutting most of the content. However, we should always keep in mind that all of this content was cut for a reason, and the developers knew exactly what would be the best outcome for the product. And it shows! Silksong is an absolutely stellar game no matter the sacrifices made in the process. So while this opinion remains subjective, I definitely feel like the version we got is better overall. Although, as said in the beginning, this video's goal is to act as a guide for modders to potentially bring some of these areas back to life, especially the Coral Gorge. Please do it. All of the room layouts have been documented at ACMI, and almost every single asset is still in the game files today. And just before anyone says it, no, the Gorge will not be DLC content. Team Cherry have confirmed that. So yeah, I am excited to see what happens over these next few years in the modding community, and also with DLCs of course. Okay, we are at the end. I want to thank Mola for discussing the progression with me, and of course the Hollow Knight wiki. This video would not be possible without them. This is for sure the last Silksong video I will make for now. There will be another one when the exhibit closes and when the DLC comes out, but that's far into the next year. I hope you've been enjoying these. It is extremely rare for me to care so much about a topic for so long. Silksong has just been so massive both in-game and outside of it, to the point it consumed my life for the last 3 or so months. And I hope that I've done this game justice with these videos. Merry Christmas, and as always, consider subscribing, check out my Patreon to support these videos, and have a damn good night.